Okay, let's get settled in. Hello, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we're going to take a look at a significant period in Spain's past, focusing on a figure who was very influential for a long, long time. We're going to talk about Francisco Franco. Now, don't feel any pressure to stay awake for this. The idea, as always, is simply to provide a gentle stream of historical facts and details that can help quiet your mind and guide you towards sleep. We'll be moving at a very relaxed pace, just covering the main points of his life and the era he lived in. Think of it less as a lecture and more as a soft murmur about history. We'll start right at the very beginning with his birth, way back in the late 19th century. We'll touch upon where he came from, his family background, and some of the early influences on his life. We'll then follow his path as he entered the military, which was a really key part of who he became. We'll discuss his experiences in North Africa, where he spent a good chunk of his early career, and how that shaped his rise through the ranks. Eventually, this will lead us to the tumultuous period of the Spanish Civil War, where he played a central role, and then into the many decades he spent as the leader of Spain. We'll cover some of the characteristics of his time in power, the changes that occurred, and eventually the transition that happened after his death. There's a lot to cover, but we'll just take it one step at a time. Let the details wash over you. There's no need to concentrate too hard. Just relax your body, breathe slowly and evenly, and if your mind wanders, that's perfectly fine. Just gently bring your attention back to the sound of the words, or let yourself drift off whenever you feel ready. We're just here to share some history in the most soothing way possible. So let's begin our very gentle journey through the life and times of Francisco Franco, starting with the very beginning. Okay, so here's the story of this fellow, Francisco Franco. The man who eventually became known as General Franco, well, he was born on the 4th of December, back in 1892. His full name at birth was Francisco Franco Bahamonde. This happened in a coastal city, Ferrol, which is in the province of Galicia, up in the northwest part of Spain. His father was a man named Nicholas Franco. Nicholas came from a family that had roots in Andalusia, and this family had a long tradition of serving in the Spanish Navy. We're talking about 6 generations of service, stretching all the way back to the early 18th century. Nicholas himself kept this tradition going, working as an officer in what they called the Spanish Naval Administrators Corps. This was during the late 19th century. However, the relationship between Nicola and his son, Francisco, it wasn't always smooth. It turned out to be quite fraught. Nicholas was known for being a bit eccentric, and he had a somewhat decadent character, and these were traits that his son, Francisco, grew to dislike about him. Francisco's mother, on the other hand, was Maria del Pilar Bahamonde de Andrade. She was a native Galician, and her family was pretty well off, part of the upper middle class. Francisco actually grew very close to his mother. He admired her strong Roman Catholic faith and the serious way she carried herself, which was quite different from his father. As Francisco was growing up, he developed a character that was disciplined and serious, even from a young age. The original plan for him was to have a career in the Spanish Navy, just like many generations of Francos before him. But things in his family life got a bit chaotic in 1907. Francisco was only 14 years old at that time. It was then that his father, Nicholas, left the family. He soon went off and married another woman in Madrid. Francisco never really forgave his father for this, and for the rest of his life, he only kept a very limited relationship with him. It's probably not just a coincidence that around the same time Nicholas Franco left his family in Galicia, Francisco decided to change his plans. He gave up on joining the Spanish Navy, and instead he entered the Spanish Infantry Academy in Toledo. He was still just 14. Part of this decision was also due to the Spanish Navy having declined quite a bit after the Spanish-American War of 1898. Francisco eventually graduated from the academy in 1910 as a second lieutenant. His performance there hadn't been super outstanding. He graduated somewhere in the lower part of his class. But you have to remember his age. Many of the other cadets at Toledo were 2 or 3 years older than him. The Spain that Franco was now entering military service for was on the edge of a long period of political trouble. Actually, Spain had been going through a very long crisis, in one form or another, for about 2 centuries. Back in the 16th century, Spain had been the top power in Europe, a real superpower for its time. This was largely thanks to its huge empire in the New World and the massive amounts of gold and silver flowing in from places like Mexico and Peru. But then, in the 17th century, the Spanish Empire started to decline rapidly. Those flows of bullion from the Americas began to dry up. So by the 18th century, Spain was more of a second-rate power, and its economy was quite backward and underdeveloped. On top of that, the country's politics were hampered by the Roman Catholic Church having too much power and a monarchy that wasn't very effective. Then, in the early 19th century, independence movements started up in South America and Central America, and these movements took away most of Spain's overseas empire. However, there was a reform movement trying to get going. During the first few years of the 19th century, Spain found itself under the influence of Napoleonic France. A new generation of Spanish politicians began calling for a complete overhaul of the country's politics, its economy, and its society. A new liberal constitution was adopted in 1812, but tensions didn't go away. As a result of these tensions, a civil war, known as the First Carlist War, happened between 1833 and 1840. This war was about who should succeed to the monarchy, and also about disputes between liberals and conservatives within the country. 2 more Carlist wars would happen later, in the late 1840s, and then again in the mid-1870s. The Third Carlist War even saw the monarchy briefly suspended, and the First Spanish Republic was created, lasting from 1873 to 1874. So when Franco was born in 1892, the country had already been through nearly a century of conflicts. These conflicts were between left-leaning liberal reformers who wanted to reduce the power of the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the Roman Catholic Church, and right-leaning conservatives who were determined to keep the traditional structures of Spanish society and politics in place. These 2 opposing forces would continue to be the main players in Spanish politics well into the early 20th century, and they really shaped the direction of Franco's life. At the time he left the Infantry Academy in Toledo in 1910, the really disastrous political confrontations that Spain would face in the 1930s were still some time away. In the early 1910s, Spain's main concerns were actually in North Africa. This was where the country still held some of the last bits of its once great colonial empire, especially after losing most of its other possessions in the Caribbean and the Philippines in the late 1890s. Morocco, in particular, had become a major focus for Spanish imperial activities. Spain had held territories there for several centuries, like the city of Ceuta, which is just across the Strait of Gibraltar. Spanish interest in that region had grown even more during the First Hispano-Moroccan War, which was between 1859 and 1860, and there were also brief conflicts with some of the Rif tribes in northern Morocco in 1893 and again in 1909. A more significant land grab happened in November 1912. A treaty was agreed upon between France and Spain, and Morocco was basically divided between them. Spain got the entire north coast of the country and a strip of land in the south, while France took the larger central parts of Morocco. But even though the agreement between the 2 European powers had set up their respective areas of influence, actually making Spanish rule a reality in the newly acquired territory was a much longer and more difficult process. The efforts to pacify the various tribes and political groups in Morocco would keep the Spanish military busy for the rest of the 1910s. And so it was that Franco, fresh out of the academy in Toledo, volunteered to take up a position in North Africa in 1912. He was 19 at the time. Franco's service in Morocco was the start of his quick rise within the Spanish military. In 1913, he was promoted to first lieutenant in an elite regiment of Moroccan cavalry. He became quite well known for his professionalism and his command abilities, and also for the concern he showed for the welfare of the troops under his command. In 1915, he was appointed as a captain, making him the youngest person in the entire Spanish army to hold that rank. But the following year, in 1916, he suffered a serious gunshot wound to his abdomen. As a result of this injury, the young Franco, who was then just 24 years old, was sent back to Spain. He would spend the next few years back in southwestern Europe. The establishment of the Spanish Foreign Legion in 1920 and Franco's appointment as second in command of this newly established brigade was what directly led to his return to North Africa in the early 1920s. This was because yet another war had broken out between the Spanish and the Berber tribes of the Rif Mountains. This particular war would last for half a decade, from 1921 to 1926. In 1923, he was promoted again, this time to the top command of the Spanish Foreign Legion. That same year, he married Maria del Carmen Polo, and they would have a daughter together in 1926. Like her mother, she was named Maria del Carmen, and she would be Franco's only child. Shortly after their marriage in 1923, Franco was called to visit Madrid for an audience with the Spanish king, Alfonso III. This meeting showed the growing fame that Franco was earning within Spain because of his military service in Morocco. Moreover, this was happening at a time when the power of the military was increasing. In September 1923, the king endorsed what was essentially a seizure of power by General Miguel Primo de Rivera. Primo de Rivera would then lead the Spanish government for the next 7 years, using the slogan "Country, Religion, Monarchy," which clearly showed his intention to rule Spain along traditional conservative lines. Back in North Africa, Franco played a key role in bringing the Rif War to a successful end in 1925 and 1926. His reputation soared throughout Spain, and he was seen as a national hero. On February 3, 1926, he was rewarded with a promotion to the rank of Brigadier General. Franco was only 33 years old at the time, and this promotion made him one of the youngest generals in any European army. 2 years later, he was appointed as the director of the newly established General Military Academy in the city of Zaragoza. These actions during the 1920s were very important for later events. Franco's subsequent rise to power in the 1930s was largely based on the reputation he had gained from his command in North Africa, and also on the loyal following he built among the graduates from the academy in Zaragoza between 1928 and the early 1930s. The events that would eventually lead to the Spanish Civil War and Franco's rise to power really started in 1930. In late January of that year, General Miguel Primo de Rivera, who had been the effective head of the Spanish government since 1923, was forced to resign. This was due to a worsening economic crisis in Spain and public unhappiness with the direction the country's politics were taking. What followed was about 15 months of political instability in the country. This culminated in municipal elections in April 1931, in which the Republicans won over 40% of the vote, compared to just 25% for the monarchists. This was widely seen as a sort of referendum on the monarchy of King Alfonso X, and he seemed to listen to the result. On the night of April 14, 1931, just 2 days after the elections, he left Spain, though he didn't formally abdicate. Earlier that same day, the Second Spanish Republic had been formally declared. This ended the Spanish monarchy and started a new period in Spanish politics. The leaders of this newly proclaimed republic then began to undertake wide-ranging reforms. They reformed the country, its economy, the role of the church, and the military. Since Franco was someone who was closely associated with Alfonso's rule and Rivera's government, his career stalled at this point. He was removed from his position at the academy in Zaragoza, and the school itself was dissolved. Franco himself was a monarchist and was ideologically opposed to the Second Spanish Republic. However, he did indicate that he was willing to accept the new situation and work with the government in the early 1930s. But this wasn't enough to stop the new government from effectively demoting him to a number of minor commands during the first few years of the Second Spanish Republic. The new republic was plagued by instability during its short life. There were attempted coups and regional instability, all of which would eventually lead to the Spanish Civil War. But before that terrible conflict broke out, the country swung from liberal to conservative regimes and then back again. In 1933, the Spanish Confederation of the Autonomous Right, CEDA, won the elections to the Spanish legislature, taking power from the liberal parties that had come to power in 1931. These 1933 elections were a good thing for Franco's then struggling career. He was restored to a more active command, and in 1934 he was promoted to Major General. That October, he was put in charge of suppressing a violent revolt among miners in the province of Asturias. These miners were unhappy with the growing influence of conservatives within the Spanish government cabinet. His successful handling of the Asturias insurrection led to him being appointed as chief of the Spanish Army's General Staff on May 19, 1935. The insurgency in Asturias and Franco's stated views on it also give us a clue as to where his ideological views and personal politics stood by this time. Franco described the insurgency as a frontier war, one that he believed was being carried out by socialists and communists with the aim of overthrowing civilization itself in Spain. So, Franco's anti-leftist credentials were being clearly established in this way, just as the Spanish political landscape was heading towards its ultimate crisis. A series of scandals in the mid-1930s led to the dissolution of Parliament and the calling of new elections for February 1936. This happened at a time when the country's politics had become polarized to an unprecedented degree. On one side, there was a left bloc of communists, socialists, and radical Republicans who united into a coalition called the Popular Front. On the other side, there was a right bloc of monarchists, conservatives, Spanish traditionalists, and ultra-Catholics. This latter group had a lot of support from elements within the military hierarchy and the colonial administration in North Africa. Despite this coalition on the right, the left was victorious in the elections of 1936. Manuel Azaña, the leader of the Republican Left Party, was quickly made president in a new government of the left. Azaña's appointment as president in 1936 was the trigger for elements on the right, particularly within the military, to start plotting a coup d'etat. As this was happening, Franco was effectively in exile. In February 1936, he had been sent to the Canary Islands to be a military commander there, a position that was essentially a form of banishment from Spain itself. Up to this point, General Franco had largely kept himself separate from any of the political parties in Spain. But now he was contacted by those elements within the military who wanted to overthrow the government of the Second Spanish Republic. Their aim was to end the anarchy that they felt had characterized Spain's politics throughout the 1930s. In June 1936, he met with the officers involved in a forest on the island of Tenerife to discuss the coup. At this point, Franco still refused to commit to the insurrection, but in the weeks that followed, he did. The revolt was to be led by three main individuals. General José Sanjurjo, a monarchist opponent of the Second Republic who was living in exile in Portugal, would be its symbolic head. Emilio Mola Vidal, who would later be made the first Duke of Mola, would lead the revolt on the Spanish mainland. Franco himself took command of the Spanish colonial armies in North Africa. The Spanish Civil War began on July 17, 1936, which was actually a day earlier than planned. It started when the Army of Africa rebelled in Morocco. The following day, Franco flew from the Canary Islands to North Africa as the rebel forces were taking control of large parts of Spain. By the end of July, the insurrectionists, who were now calling their broad coalition of political groupings the Nationalists, had gained the support of elements throughout North Africa and in towns and rural areas like Zaragoza, Sevilla, Cordoba, Valladolid, Burgos, and Pamplona in Spain itself. However, the government, broadly identified as the Republicans, managed to keep control over the largest cities, including Madrid, Barcelona, Bilbao, Malaga, and Valencia. With both sides holding or seizing substantial parts of the country, the stage was set for a long and very bitter conflict. This situation was made worse by the political, economic, and military aid that both sides were receiving. The Republicans were quickly supported by Soviet Russia. Aid and direct military support were channeled to the Nationalists by the Nazi regime, led by Adolf Hitler in Germany and the fascist government of Benito Mussolini in Italy. Other nations like the United States, France, and Britain declared that they were neutral, but they couldn't stop independent brigades from forming and traveling to Spain to fight on behalf of one side or the other. Because of all this, the Spanish Civil War became a kind of proxy war in the larger showdown between the political right and left in Europe in the years just before the outbreak of the Second World War. It also served as a way to test out new developments in military hardware that had been made since the First World War, particularly the rapid advances in airplanes that had occurred since the 1910s. The Civil War itself turned into a long war of attrition. After quickly seizing the Spanish protectorate in North Africa in late July 1936, Franco was able to transport a large part of the North African army, which consisted of about 30,000 men, to Andalusia in southwestern Spain in early August. He then began a march on Madrid with the goal of capturing the Spanish capital from the Republicans and bringing the war to a quick end. However, by the time he advanced on the city in October 1936, enough significant aid had been sent to the Republicans by the Soviets and other communist powers that Franco failed to secure the Spanish capital. With that failure, the possibility of a short, swift victory for the Nationalists was gone. As the war settled into a protracted struggle in late 1936 and into 1937, the Nationalists organized themselves into a provisional government at Burgos. Burgos was a town to the north of Madrid that had once been a capital of the Kingdom of Castile, making it a symbolic site for the Nationalist government during the Civil War. On October 1st, 1936, Franco was proclaimed Generalissimo of the Nationalist Army. He would soon become the supreme leader of the Nationalists in the Civil War. This was because on just the third day of the rebellion, July 20th, 1936, General José Sanjurjo had been killed when his plane crashed while he was flying back to Spain from Portugal. Then, on June 3rd, 1937, Emilio Mola was also killed in an accident when his plane flew into the side of a mountain due to bad weather, while he was flying to Vitoria in the Basque Country. These events left Franco as the undisputed leader of the Nationalists in the Civil War and really paved the way for his dictatorship after it ended. The year 1937 also saw the formation of the political party that would come to dominate Spanish politics until the 1970s. Back in 1934, amidst the ferment of Spanish radical politics before the Civil War broke out, a new political party, the Falange Española, or Spanish Falange, had been established. This was effectively a fascist party similar to the National Socialists in Germany. It was far-right, anti-communist, and a strong supporter of the Roman Catholic Church. Franco hadn't been associated with the Falange in its early years, but in April 1937 he merged this fascist party with a number of other right-wing political groupings in Spain. These included monarchists and ultra-Catholic groups, and they formed the Falange Española Tradicionalista y de las Juntas de Ofensiva Nacional Sindicalista, which means the traditionalist Spanish phalange of the councils of the National Syndicalist Offensive. So, from the summer of 1937, Franco was the undisputed leader of the Nationalists. The Nationalists were also making progress in securing the more peripheral parts of the country. By early 1937, they controlled most of the west of the country, with key strongholds in A Coruña and León in the north, and Sevilla and Granada in the south. Meanwhile, the Republicans still controlled the eastern coastal parts of Spain, the Basque country in the northeast, and the central Meseta region, which included Madrid. In 1937, military operations were largely focused on the northeast, in the Basque country. This area had been secured for the Republican cause in the early months of the war. A concerted effort by the Nationalists to secure this area was undertaken in the spring of 1937. The Basque campaign has become infamous for one of the most notorious atrocities committed during the Spanish Civil War, the bombing of the town of Guernica in northern Spain in late April 1937. This bombing was carried out by the Condor Legion, which was provided by Nazi Germany and the Legionary Air Force sent to Spain by Italy. Hundreds of Spanish civilians were killed in this bombing, which was intended to pave the way for Franco's subsequent capture of Bilbao in the region and the securing of northern Spain for the nationalist cause. The exact number of casualties is still a matter of considerable debate, with estimates ranging from several hundred to over 1,000. These were largely civilians, and there's little doubt that it was a major atrocity committed by the Nationalists. In the aftermath of Guernica, the Nationalists made rapid advances in the north and northeast. The regional capital of Bilbao fell to them on June 19, 1937, after a siege that lasted 2 months. The conquest of the Basque country was completed in October 1937. This brought the Nationalists into more secure control of the northeast and the Aragonese countryside. Further south, however, the Republicans still held strongholds in the Meseta and all along the Mediterranean coast, including the cities of Barcelona and Valencia. The year 1938 was the critical year in deciding the outcome of the war. In the closing weeks of 1937, the Republicans attempted to retake the city of Teruel in eastern Aragon. Teruel lies inland from the Mediterranean coast, roughly halfway between Barcelona and Valencia. Their goal was twofold. If Teruel could be captured, it would better secure Catalonia for the Republican cause. Also, it was believed that a pincer movement into the region would distract Franco from any attempt to take Madrid. The town soon became the focus of an intense confrontation between the Republicans and the Nationalists. Both sides flooded the region with well over 100,000 troops each in the dying weeks of 1937 and the first days of 1938. Franco himself diverted his attention to Teruel just before Christmas Day 1937. Bloody and intense fighting between December and February resulted in each side suffering over 60,000 casualties. This death toll was made even worse by the worst winter Spain had experienced in 20 years. The Republicans eventually took the town early in January, but a sustained nationalist counteroffensive reclaimed it in mid-February, bringing the Battle of Teruel to an end. Teruel effectively exhausted the resources of the Republicans. Its significance for the course of the Spanish Civil War far exceeded the strategic importance of the town itself. In the aftermath of this battle, Franco wasted little time in taking advantage of having gained the strategic upper hand. In early March, an offensive eastwards towards the Mediterranean coastline was underway. By April, the Nationalists had entered the provinces of Catalonia and Valencia, securing a large stretch of the Mediterranean coastline by mid-April. As a result of this offensive, the Republicans were asking for peace terms by the early summer of 1938. They had been reduced to holding the Meseta eastwards to Valencia and a small, isolated pocket of territory in the northeast, centered on Barcelona. The final push came in late 1938 and early 1939. On December 23, 1938, the Nationalists invaded Catalonia. Cut off from the main Republican strongholds between Madrid and Valencia, the leftists had little hope there. Tarragona fell on January 15, 1939. A major event occurred on the 26th when Barcelona was taken by Franco's forces. This event made it clear that the Civil War was effectively over. Weeks later, the governments of Britain and France, which had previously tried to avoid officially favoring one side or the other, recognized Franco and the Phalangists as the official government of Spain. The Spanish Civil War was brought to an end in the spring of 1939. On March the 6th, the Republican Prime Minister, Juan Negrin, fled to France in the face of an insurrection within the Republican military, which now sued for peace terms. A final military operation by the Nationalists began in late March. On March 28th, Franco's troops entered Madrid, followed 2 days later by the capitulation of Valencia. On April 1st, Franco made a speech that was broadcast via radio throughout Spain, in which he declared victory for the nationalist cause. That same day, the last Republican stronghold, the Mediterranean town of Alicante, surrendered. After nearly 3 years, the Spanish Civil War was over. Franco was now the undisputed ruler of Spain. Franco's first weeks as the unequivocal head of the Spanish state were quite bloody. Leading historians of the regime estimate that at least 30,000 Republicans were executed in the weeks and months following the end of hostilities. Tens of thousands more were imprisoned. Hundreds of thousands more fled from the country, many leaving for South America, and approximately 500,000 streamed over the Pyrenees to France to find refuge there. For years afterwards, this kind of persecution of Republicans and their families would continue, and it's considered one of the greatest crimes of Franco's regime. Although Spain's new leader aspired to rejuvenate the country after the war, he was to be immediately thwarted in this by events happening elsewhere in Europe involving his former allies. Nazi Germany's involvement in the Spanish Civil War had been just one part of a much wider pattern of German aggression throughout Europe during the mid to late 1930s. In March 1936, the Rhineland region of Western Germany was remilitarized. 2 years later, in March 1938, a more aggressive action was taken when Germany effectively annexed Austria into Greater Germany. Then, in early 1939, the rest of Central Europe was brought under Nazi control when parts of Czechoslovakia and Hungary were formed into puppet regimes or annexed. Britain and France had tried to appease Hitler and the Nazis as all of this was happening. But when Germany invaded Poland on September the 1st, 1939, it was a step too far. 2 days later, the governments in London and Paris declared war. One might have assumed that Franco would have been an obvious ally of Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy when the Second World War erupted throughout Europe in September 1939. After all, both the Germans and the Italians had provided significant, perhaps crucial support to the Spanish fascists during the Spanish Civil War, and as a result had paved the way for Franco's rise to power. And yet, Spain would remain neutral for the most part throughout the conflict. Franco's reasons for not joining the Axis powers during the war were mixed. In the autumn of 1939, the main motive was sheer war exhaustion. The Spanish Civil War had only ended in April 1939, and there was a country to be rebuilt, and civil strife to be recovered from when the issue arose of whether to join Hitler and Mussolini in their general war just a few months later. But Franco's stance in this regard shifted considerably in the months ahead. Following the lightning-quick conquest of Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France by Germany in the late spring and early summer of 1940, the Spanish dictator indicated to Hitler in mid-June 1940 that he was willing to join the war. Negotiations to this effect were held at Hendaye in southern France on October 23, 1940, between Franco and Hitler. But here, the German chancellor balked at Franco's demands for supplies from Germany and a promise of future control of Gibraltar and French North Africa. Once these early negotiations to bring Spain directly into the war on the side of the Axis powers failed, Franco generally steered an opportunistic political course for the remainder of the war. For instance, he sanctioned the formation of a unit of Spanish volunteers to serve in the German war effort, but he strictly stipulated that this Blue Division was only to be allowed to serve on the Eastern Front against Soviet Russia, as he did not wish to damage Spain's relations with the US and Britain. Similarly, Spanish troops were stationed in the Pyrenees from 1941 onwards to prevent any attempt by Hitler to occupy the Iberian Peninsula for strategic reasons. More revealingly, Franco shifted his stance as the course of the war altered. In 1942 and 1943, with the German armies having been stopped on the Eastern Front and then forced into a retreat back towards Poland and Germany by the advancing Soviet Red Army, Franco saw that Hitler and his allies were doomed. Accordingly, he began engaging in a more strict neutrality and was increasingly accommodating of the Allies from 1943 onwards. Allied troops who were downed in France during air missions could flee to Spain and were given safe passage back to their respective countries from the Iberian Peninsula. This certainly gained the appreciation of both the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the time. But Franco was not so well liked in the aftermath of the war by the Western powers. In the aftermath of the global conflict, Spain was not invited to join the newly established United Nations. This was owing to the sympathetic stance it had displayed towards Nazi Germany during the war, and the country under Franco was ultimately excluded from that international body until 1955. Once the Second World War concluded in 1945, Spain finally found itself free of either its own civil war being fought internally or a global war raging everywhere around it for the first time in nearly a decade. Indeed, the 30 years between 1945 and Franco's death in 1975 was, despite the dictatorship, arguably the most protracted period of political stability enjoyed by Spain since the 18th century. Francoist Spain, as it is known, was ruled by Franco as the supreme head of state. He took on the title of Caudillo de España, meaning the leader of Spain. There's little doubt that this was, in essence, a dictatorship, but it was one that became more optimistic in the aftermath of the Second World War. And although Franco courted the support of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy at the time of the Spanish Civil War, Franco himself cannot really be termed an ideological fascist. His was a military dictatorship, one that sought to foster the core values of the conservative movement, which had formed one part of Spain's political landscape since the 19th century. Specifically, these values were nationalism, support for the Roman Catholic Church, and an opposition to leftist politics, particularly socialists and communists. The Falange Española, which Franco had formed out of the various right-wing Spanish political parties in 1937, was the sole legal party in the country between the conclusion of the Civil War in 1939 and the end of the Franco regime in the 1970s. But there was also a distinct drift away from the party's fascist roots of the 1930s during the post-war period. This was symbolized in the rebranding of the Falange as a Movimiento Nacional, or national movement, in 1958. Yet this is not to suggest that Franco did not engage in harsh political repression. Trade unionism and left-leaning political organizations were generally monitored and suppressed, while many socialist organizations were banned by the state. Similarly, Franco's regime sought to impose a harsh suppression of the many regional separatist movements in areas such as the Basque Country and Catalonia, which have so characterized the history of modern Spain. Such policies, though, were only so effective. Indeed, in some instances, they proved counterproductive. Attempts to curb Basque separatism, for instance, simply led to the formation of the Euskadi Ta Askatasuna organization, or ETA for short, in 1959, meaning Basque Homeland and Liberty. ETA developed in the 1960s into a terrorist paramilitary organization bent on using bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings to pressure the Spanish state in order to gain independence for the Basque region in northern Spain. Other authoritarian policies have cast a shadow over the Franco regime. Surely one of the most heinous aspects of Franco's dictatorship was the abduction of the children of Spanish Republicans and their fostering out to nationalist families. Much of the goal here was a form of social engineering, whereby these children, who would most likely be raised as left-leaning socialists and Republicans if they remained in their original family units, would now be raised as conservatives and traditionalists in line with the political ideologies of the Francoist regime. This practice had started during the Civil War, often involving children whose parents had been killed during the conflict, but it intensified to soon involve the children of Republicans who were arrested and imprisoned. It continued into the 1940s before petering out in the 1950s, and eventually involved tens of thousands of children, perhaps even into the hundreds of thousands. Many of these children never knew the circumstances of their birth or were never repatriated to their parents. The legacy of what has been termed the lost children of Francoism was undoubtedly one of the worst crimes perpetuated by Franco's dictatorship. Elsewhere in the 1940s and 1950s, the powerful position of the Roman Catholic Church throughout Spanish society was cemented through Franco's policies. The Church's close alliance with Franco ensured that it was given almost complete control over the country's educational system, including Spain's universities, where lecturers and professors were screened for their Catholic credentials. In Spanish society, divorce, contraception, and abortions were all prohibited. Most oppressive was the treatment of women in Spanish society. The Second Republic had adopted many of the progressive measures which had developed for women's rights in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, but these laws were now repealed, and women were increasingly confined to traditional roles in the 1940s and 1950s. As a result, women in Spain were prohibited from working in many professions and needed the permission of a husband or male relative to do something as simple as open a bank account. The middle years of the Franco regime in the late 1950s also saw considerable changes in Spain's colonial possessions in North Africa. In 1956, the French-held parts of Morocco gained independence, and the Spanish state simultaneously agreed to relinquish some of the territory it had acquired in Northwest Africa nearly half a century earlier. Yet, this did not prevent conflict from erupting between Franco's Spain and the Morocco of Sultan Mohammed V in 1957. The Ifni War, as it has become known, dragged on for 8 months into the summer of 1958 and resulted in Spain ceding Tarfaya to Morocco. Further territory would be ceded in subsequent years, and the Spanish colonies in the Gulf of Guinea were granted independence as Equatorial Guinea in 1968. Whilst in 1975, shortly before Franco's death, a withdrawal began from the extensive territory known as Spanish Sahara, the sovereignty of which is still contested today between Morocco and Mauritania. Yet, some small enclaves in northwestern Africa have been retained down to the present day, notably the cities of Ceuta and Melilla in northern Morocco. There were ambiguities to all this. As time passed and the memory of the Civil War faded, and the regime became more liberal, the White Terror, as the Francoist oppression of the Republicans both during and immediately after the war has become known, petered out gradually in the 1940s. Though much of this was owing to the regime simply no longer having any enemies at home to persecute. Concentration camps, which had been set up to hold Republican prisoners in the late 1930s, gradually disappeared from Spain. The last one at Miranda de Ebro near Burgos was closed in 1947. By way of contrast, from the late 1950s onwards, and in particular during the 1960s, unofficially sanctioned trade unions began to operate in Spain and were not crushed or clamped down on in the manner which they almost certainly would have been had they tried to operate in the 1940s. In other ways, Spanish society was undergoing some limited liberalization from the late 1950s onwards. For instance, some of the restrictions on what women could or could not do were relaxed in the 1960s. Censorship of the press and the media also became less severe in the last 15 or so years of Franco's dictatorship, although any overt criticism of the regime itself remained a crime. Much of this must be viewed in light of the country's drift into the Western capitalist bloc of states, led by the United States during the Cold War from 1955 onwards. As Spain found common ground with these countries, Franco became less authoritarian at home and more inclined to liberalize certain aspects of Spanish society. The ambiguities of Franco's dictatorship are most clearly evident when examining his economic policy. It is impossible to dismiss the success of Spain's economy during Franco's tenure as the Spanish head of state. Ever since the late 17th century, the country had languished in a state of seemingly perpetual economic backwardness, with a lack of industry and an over-reliance on unproductive farming methods carried out on large estates. All of this was compounded by the devastation caused by the Spanish Civil War, and for much of the 1940s, the country was on the brink of bankruptcy, with only a meager economic recovery occurring. However, from the late 1950s, economic growth took off to such an extent that the last 15 or so years of Franco's regime has been dubbed the Spanish Miracle, or El Milagro Español in economic terms. During these years, the country had the second fastest growing economy in the world. Only Japan, which was undergoing its own economic miracle, grew at a faster rate between the late 1950s and the early 1970s. The Spanish miracle came about owing to a combination of factors, not least a series of national development plans devised by Franco's ministers and the adoption of a free market economy in 1959. Iron and steel factories proliferated in the northern provinces, and these in turn supplied raw materials for a thriving shipbuilding industry in the ports of the northern coast. Petrochemicals became a major national industry, and new corporations emerged, notably the Seat Automobile Company. In 1946, there were just over 70,000 private cars in Spain. This number had increased to over 1 million cars 20 years later. More than 750,000 seat cars were produced during the years of the Spanish miracle. As a result of all this, Spain went from being one of the most economically backward countries in Western Europe to being the world's 9th largest economy by the end of Franco's regime. Thereafter, the global economic recession of the mid to late 1970s saw Spain's economic growth stall. But there is no doubting that the Spanish miracle hauled the country's economy out of the stagnation in which it had wallowed for 2 centuries and brought it into the 20th century. This, combined with the massive expansion of the tourism sector in the post-Franco period, created the economy of modern Spain. And whatever his other failings and crimes may have been, this must be acknowledged as a major success of Franco's time in power. Perhaps in assessing Franco's career and the nature of his regime, we should also consider that he did not work to ensure the continuity of his dictatorship. This might have been partly owing to his lack of a male heir. Franco's marriage produced just one child, his daughter Maria del Carmen, born in 1926. Had the caudillo had a male heir to pass the dictatorship to, he might have made provision to ensure that this occurred, but he didn't. Indeed, Franco had taken steps to restore the Spanish monarchy as early as 1947, when an official referendum was held to make Spain a monarchy once again. Although it was passed, no new king was crowned at that time, and Franco instead had his powers as a regent for life ratified. As he neared the end of his life, though, he took more concerted steps to restore the monarchy, culminating in 1969 when Juan Carlos of the old royal House of Bourbon was named as Franco's successor and made a prince. 2 years earlier, steps had been taken to allow freer elections to the Spanish legislature. Then, in 1973, Franco resigned his position as Premier of Spain and head of the government in favor of Luis Carrero Blanco. Blanco was a long-standing ally of Franco's, who had fought with the Generalissimo in North Africa in the 1920s and during the Spanish Civil War. But his tenure as Prime Minister was short-lived, as he was killed by a roadside bomb by the Basque terrorist group ETA in the final days of 1973. Two further individuals, Torquato Fernandez Miranda and Carlos Arias Navarro, would subsequently serve as Prime Ministers of Spain before Franco's death. But despite this partial relinquishing of power, Franco retained many of his positions, still serving as head of state, albeit in a much more limited capacity, and also retaining control over the Spanish military. Nevertheless, the measures taken from the late 1960s constituted some significant steps towards transitioning towards a less authoritarian regime. And at the end of Franco's life and following his death, the country would quickly transition to a democracy. This would come in the mid-1970s. By the late 1960s, Franco was approaching 80 years of age. His health was declining considerably. This worsened into the 1970s, in part because the Spanish dictator was suffering from Parkinson's disease. In 1974, he was sufficiently incapacitated on a number of occasions that his duties were passed in part to Prince Juan Carlos. His last official engagement occurred on October 1st, 1975, when he gave a speech in Madrid, where he was said to have been looking particularly frail. 4 weeks later, he fell into a coma and was put on a life support machine. There is some dispute as to whether he died on the 19th of November or in the early hours of the 20th, either from a heart attack or septic shock. His body was buried in the Valley of the Fallen, a huge burial tomb near Madrid, which had been constructed as a mausoleum and a memorial to those who had died in the Civil War, though it has recently been exhumed from here and removed to a family crypt on the outskirts of the Spanish capital. Although he professed a commitment to maintaining the system Franco had created and overseen for over 35 years, Juan Carlos moved to rapidly dismantle the authoritarian Francoist state as soon as the caudillo died in the early winter of 1975. A constitutional monarchy was established in the 3 years that followed. On June 15, 1977, the first free and open general election to have been held in Spain since 1936 took place, returning a high number of centrist and left-wing delegates to Parliament, an indication of the shift away from the right-wing politics of the Franco era. A year and a half later, a new constitution was ratified in December 1978. This has become the basis of Spain's modern constitutional monarchy. The total failure of an attempted coup d'etat in February 1981 by elements within the Spanish military who wished to see a restoration of authoritarianism in Spain was indicative of how quickly the country had successfully transitioned into a liberal democracy in the years immediately following Franco's death. General Francisco Franco is perhaps the most ambiguous of the dictators who seized power throughout Europe in the mid-20th century. He came to power as a result of a bloody civil war in which the conservative military bloc which he led was forever tarnished through a series of atrocities, such as occurred in Guernica in April 1937, and through its associations with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in the 1930s and 1940s. In particular, Franco's regime was responsible for the killing, arrest, or drastic interference in the lives of millions of Spanish civilians. This was especially the case in the aftermath of the Civil War, when the Spanish courts were dealing in the summary conviction and execution of hundreds of Republicans every day for months on end. Any assessment of his career must start by acknowledging this terrible legacy. But there is also little doubting that the Franco regime changed over time. In particular, as it entered the 1950s, Francoist Spain became less repressive, switching from an overt totalitarianism to a less brutal authoritarianism. There were also a number of considerable advances in Spanish society in the last 2 decades or so of Franco's regime, with a growing affinity with the U.S. Western Bloc of Powers from 1955, when the country was admitted to the United Nations. Most significantly, the Spanish economic miracle, which occurred between 1959 and the mid-1970s, finally hauled Spain out of the economic malaise it had been languishing in since the 18th century and made it one of the world's ascendant economic powerhouses. This created economic opportunities and prosperity for the Spanish working and middle class, which was unparalleled up to that point in modern Spanish history. This certainly does not excuse Franco's crimes, but it should be considered in any balanced appraisal of his time in power. And then there is the character of Franco himself. Who or what was he? He was an exceptionally private man, and the real Francisco Franco is hard to identify. Perhaps he might best be defined as a product of Spain itself, and one who shifted his own political stances in line with the prevailing trends of European and global politics between the 1930s and the 1970s. In the years leading up to the Civil War, he was a staunch advocate of Spanish conservatism, one of the 2 prevailing political stances in the country since the early 19th century. In this respect, he was an ardent anti-communist, a feature which was perhaps the most consistent aspect of his political views throughout his 4 decades in power. However, despite his ties to Hitler and Mussolini, Francisco Franco was not really a fascist. And in the course of the 1950s, the regime softened its stances considerably, eventually drifting towards closer ties with the U.S. and the Western European states as the Cold War made the right-wing Spanish regime a natural ally. Thus, Franco adapted to fit the prevailing political winds. Perhaps this was who he was in the end, a political chameleon, born of the chaos of Spanish politics in the age of extremes which characterized Europe in the first half of the 20th century. So, what are people's thoughts on General Franco? Should he be viewed entirely based on his brutal takeover of Spain in the 1930s, or did his later rule substantially rehabilitate him from his earlier crimes? People can share their opinions in the comments section, and, well, that's pretty much the overview. Thanks for listening.